Hello, thanks for joining me. Today we're going to talk about evolutionary game theory and in particular its application to intergroup conflict. So I'll start with an introduction to individual conflict and the hawk-dove model. I'll then go on to discuss whether we can just treat groups like individuals. We can't. Then I'll move from there to talk about our new paper, The Evolution of Democratic Peace in Animal Societies by Kingsley Hunt and co-authors, of which I'm one of. I'll put the URL for the paper and for Kingsley's blog about the paper in the description below. Okay, so what happens when two different groups of animals meet? They fight, they cooperate. Well, that's a bit of a trick question because the answer is it depends. If you're a banded mongoose, then the answer is pretty gruesome. But take bonobos as another example. The best evidence is that group interactions between bonobos is pretty peaceful, if not cooperative. So taking a step back from intergroup conflict and back into individual conflict, this was the same observation which inspired John Maynard Smith and George Price in 1973 to write their seminal paper, The Logic of Animal Group Conflict. Their observation that individuals rarely fight to the death was often answered with recourse to group selection or species level selection ideas. So why don't two lions rip each other apart every time they meet? The previous answer given was that it's in the species' best interest that they don't tear each other apart. Now, these sorts of arguments never really stand up to scrutiny and the logic of Darwinian selection. So when Maynard Smith and Price came along and proposed an individually consistent model, people listened. Their hawk-dove model works like this. It involves two strategies, hawk and dove, where they have a valuable resource, V. So this is a quantity that they are competing over. It might be mates or food resources. But if they're going to really go into one to try and get this resource, they're going to sometimes suffer the consequences, C being the cost of escalated fights. If in the model, if two hawks meet, they fight, we're always going to be looking at individual one being our focal. So a fight has 50% chance of winning, but also has 50% chance of paying the brunt of the costs. If a hawk meets a dove, the hawk will gain the resource V, while if the dove is our focal individual, walks away with nothing. The dove, if two doves meet, they're going to share the resource V between them. Okay, but looks like hawks have pretty much got this one in the bag until here. And here's the trick: if you think that it's quite reasonable to assume that there's many cases where the costs actually outweigh the value of the resource. And in this case, we can already see why hawks can't be what we call an evolutionarily stable strategy amongst themselves. Because if you're in 100% hawk population and you're a hawk, what do you get? You get V and half of that. But then half the time you're going to pay this cost, which is greater than that value that you could have won. So you're going to get a negative payoff in if you play another hawk. But if you're a dove in this population of 100% hawk, you're going to get 0, which is already looking better than a negative value. So in these cases where C is greater than V, then P, which is the proportion of hawks in the population, P will be less than 1. Now, this model, even in its present form, has been applied to intergroup conflict. How they do that is simply swapping the word individual for group, and you have your intergroup hawk-dove model. So the assumption, which might sometimes be met, is that groups can agree on an appropriate strategy to play. But this doesn't really cohere with the intrinsic heterogeneity of animal groups, including humans, which differ, and we argue, in two key aspects, and that is that there are differences in incentives, so that is which individuals have more to gain or more to pay for these encounters. So how incentivized are they to have conflict or cooperation with other groups? And then influence, so how much are they able to guide this strategy of their group? The first paper to tackle this heterogeneity, to my knowledge, is the paper by Rufus Johnston and colleagues in 2020, published in PNAS. They considered two classes of individuals, leaders and followers. Leaders get the entire say over whether the group plays hawk or dove, and also get an unfair share of the rewards. If the rewards were sort of a big circle, which we call V, then the leaders would get an unfair share, which we might call VL, whereas the followers might get VF. And the leaders also got pay an unfairly, or the followers pay an unfairly large proportion of the costs in their model. So when it comes to costs, you might have a smaller amount for the leaders than for the followers. So these represent situations where leaders might be socially dominant to their followers. They might be able to displace them from contested resources such as food obtained after victory, and pay less of the costs. These leaders, maybe they are larger individuals, tougher, able to take up safer positions, such as at the back of the group. So here the game changes. For the leaders, we might have now the matrix now reflects that they have a larger share of the rewards and less of a share of the costs. And at this point, we can do some algebra. We can say, when would we expect the fitness of a leader playing hawk to outweigh fitness, denoted by W, of a leader playing dove? And so this really depends on how many hawks and how many doves they meet in the population, right? It's all to do with the proportion of opponent hawks. So our leader hawk on this side of the inequality is going to meet a hawk P proportion of time. So P times BL CL over 2, and then the other 1 minus P proportion of the time, they get the full reward. 1 minus, so VL. And fitness for a leader playing dove, well, P proportion of time they meet a hawk. They get nothing. And then the rest of the time, is just meeting a dove, and they get VL over 2. But what I'm going to do is, I could write over 2 here at the bottom, but I'm going to move it to the left here. Now we can see we have 1 minus P times VL on the left and on the right of the equation, so we can subtract half 1 minus P VL on both sides, which leaves a half 1 minus P VL on the left hand side. We can also evaluate this P times 0. P times 0 is 0. What else can we do? We can bring this half on the left hand side, bring that outside the brackets as well, and now times both sides of the equation by 2. Simplifies things a lot. So just get rid of the halves. And now I'm going to finally use the second line to multiply out the brackets. Okay. Noticing that we have PVL and minus PVL on the same side of the equation, we can essentially remove both of them and then add PCL to both sides. Divide both sides by CL. Leads to the final simplified version. P, when VL over CL is greater than P, the leaders will have more to gain by playing hawk strategy. Now, this is basically what was going on in the individual level version of the model, except V over C always had to be less than 1. Now that it's not so equal anymore, and that VL can be quite large, CL can be quite small, it's actually possible that VL over CL is greater than 1. So obviously you can't play hawk more than 100% of the time, but what would happen in the model is that if we plot C on the x-axis, and we'll give it some numbers, 0, 1, 2, and 3, and we're going to say that B equals 1. And we'll call P star, oh, it's just gone out of view a tiny bit. We'll call P star the critical value of P, which makes playing hawk a better strategy for the leaders than playing dove. And what we get is we get playing 100%. This is the same in the individual level model of the hawk-dove model. And at the point where C is greater than V, usually you get a tailing off at that point of critical P. But what you get in the heterogeneous hawk-dove model is that even for greater values of C, you can get all-out war playing. So the findings are interpreted that when there's unequal share of the resources and unequal share of the decision which strategy to play, that warmongering, that is picking fights that are only for your own good, can be evolutionarily stable. Now remember, the leaders in this model were able to completely monopolize the decision to play hawk or dove. This made sense in their model because they were basing it on observations of banded mongoose populations. In banded mongoose populations, you've got females and males, so that was where they got the two classes from. And then the females are able to guide the males, because when they're in estrus, an intrinsic part of the biology is that males will follow females as their mate, guarding them. They'll follow them nose to tail, and they'll follow them around wherever the females go. Now, the females can make use of this by guiding the males to areas that might not necessarily be in the male's best interest. So the females like to have interactions with other groups. Why is that? Because they get mating opportunities with males that aren't the same old bunch they've been hanging out with. But for the males, interacting with other groups carries disastrous consequences where, for example, there's a lot of injury and even mortality in the males, which isn't seen in the females from these intergroup encounters. So really the natural point that we wanted to build on from this was to say, right, this can sometimes be the case that one class of individuals gets to monopolize that decision of where the group move, but it's really exists on a more of a continuum. In some species, they have these well-defined leaders. Elephants, for example, the matriarchs guide the group. But in lots of other species, collective decisions, movement decisions, are equally shared among the group. Even if they have dominant individuals, sometimes the decisions themselves are shared equally. So how do we model collective decisions that range from shared amongst everyone to concentrated and controlled by one class of individuals? Well, let's consider a group of spiders, because that's about all I can draw. And these spiders are poised on the border, their own territory and other groups. Territory border there. Some phenotypes for these individuals. We've got, let's say, 2 leaders and 3 followers, and we're interested, we know that the followers, based on the last model, for now want to stray away from danger, whereas the leaders want to get into that other group's territory for mating or resource opportunities. What is the decision that this group is going to make? Well, before I get into that, it's best to go through a few new parameters with you. We've got epsilon, which is the proportion of leaders, and then 1 minus epsilon proportion of followers. What else? We've got now what we might call a leader preference or leader decision. I'm going to call it leader decision. These are these arrows facing in or out, towards or away from the other group's territory. And so then we've got these parameters, but then we've also got sort of example values that we've given in this toy example. The proportion of leaders being 0.4, proportion of followers 0.6. In this example, the leaders want to go totally into, they're not wavering on this decision, they want to go in, they want to play hawk, whereas the followers want to play dove. Now, the next assumption we make is that collective decisions of the group are determined. So what the group eventually play is now P. Oh, I can see that I've missed an F here. What the group eventually play, the collective decision is P, and our assumption is that this is a function of what the leaders want multiplied by the leaders' strength in numbers plus what the followers want multiplied by the followers' strength in numbers. But crucially, the followers might or might not have as much of a say as the leader class. So here's where we need a final parameter, which is called the democracy parameter. And we're going to walk through examples where this democracy parameter takes values of 0 and 1. But if you like, you could do the example where it equals 0.5 or any number you like. So back to the equation at the top. Followers are multiplied by their strength in numbers, but they're also multiplied by this democracy parameter. The whole sum is divided by the number, the proportion of the group that actually get a say in the decision. So I'm not going to actually plug in all of these numbers, but if you can do it yourself if you like. But when democracy is 0, P equals 1. When democracy equals 1, P equals 0.4. So what have we seen? That when there is no democracy, leaders get their preference, their preferred decision. And when democracy equals 1, it's a shared collective decision. The 3 votes for 0 are counted in. It's basically a weighted mean of the preferences. So the equation might look complex, but it's really just simply to get the most intuitive output of two classes of individuals voting. All right, now we can start to plot this. We put democracy on the x-axis and P on the y-axis, but we'll have 3 different versions of P. We'll have P in black, PL, the leader decision, in green, and PF, follower decision, in blue. So we've seen that when democracy was 0, in our numerical example, P was equal to 1, which was PL. That's because PL, when democracy score is 0, if we look at the top left now, this term disappears because 0 times anything is 0. Likewise for this, we're left with PL epsilon over epsilon. Epsilon divided by itself cancels out, and P is equal to PL. But what is the evolutionarily stable value that P takes for any PL, not just for the numerical example we saw earlier? Well, this is where we lean on the derivation we saw earlier, and recall that when P is less than PL over CL, then the leaders will always do better by playing hawk. So PL only moves in one direction. They keep getting more aggressive until they're playing obligate hawk. Same goes when P is greater than PL over CL. Except here dove is always the better strategy to play, and they'll evolve down towards dove. Same can be said for followers. When P is less than the critical threshold, so now think of this as maybe when P is low, they're really likely to encounter a dove group where it's lower than this critical threshold. So the followers in this case would prefer to play hawk if the population is playing lower than their threshold. But if the population is more aggressive than their critical threshold, then they evolve towards 0. So it's really critical, VL over CL and VF over CF. I'm going to now plot as horizontal lines. I'm going to put VL over CL here, and I'm going to put VF over CF below this. This is following the assumption that the leaders are advantaged in some way, so they're getting more of the benefits and paying less of the costs from conflict. This assumption can be relaxed later, but we'll stick with it for the first version. So we know P equals VL, which is going to be equal to VL over CL, because if population is really aggressive, the leaders are going to prefer to play dove, and if the population is really passive, they're going to evolve to become more aggressive. And the only stable point on the only stable equilibrium is at VL over CL. So P is equal to VL over CL, and PL is also equal to VL over CL. Now, what are the followers going to play when this is the case? Well, here's where we can go back to our derivations and say, okay, what happens when P is greater than VF over CF? Well, we see that PF tends towards 0. They're always going to do better playing dove. So they're going to evolve towards trying to avoid encounters with other groups, or at least being peaceful when they meet. And now the question we've all been waiting for: what happens when democracy increases? We might expect that the population hawk playing becomes more peaceful in line with democracy increasing, the followers preferring more peaceful resolutions. But this isn't actually what happens, not at least at first, because the followers are stuck playing obligate dove. They can't get more passive, whereas the leaders, any increase in democracy just leads to the leaders counterbalancing the equation by increasing their aggressiveness, keeping the population level strategy under leader control, at least at first. This changes when the leaders can't increase their aggressiveness anymore. They hit a ceiling of P equals 1. They become obligate hawks. At what point on the democracy spectrum do they hit their ceiling? We can figure this out by deriving the solution. We know that P is equal to VL over CL, but we might just use a shorter notation of V tilde L for that. We know PF is equal to 0, and we know PL is equal to 1. So using the equation above, we can substitute in V tilde L equals epsilon over epsilon plus omega 1 minus epsilon. I'll do now solving for democracy. subtracting v tilde epsilon from each side. Bringing epsilon outside bracket. And dividing both sides by VL1 minus epsilon gives so when democracy is equal to this value, then we end the what we call the leader control phase, and we enter into phase we call compromise. In this compromise phase, leaders and followers play obligate hawk and dove respectively, and P takes the value of PF is 0, PL is 1, similar to how it was before, and P in black is equal to epsilon, so on and so forth. This means that P starts to decrease. When P goes lower than VL over CL, we can see hawks play obligate hawk across this whole period, but P is still higher than VF over CF during this period. So the doves are playing, the followers are playing obligate dove. This changes when omega equals epsilon 1 minus V tilde F over V tilde F 1 minus epsilon. I didn't do the derivation this time, very similar to that one where we found this point here, but now we're finding this point here, at which we enter the final phase of follower control. The leaders, still with P lower than their critical threshold, play optimal obligate hawk. P now assumes the follower critical threshold, and the followers actually start to increase their aggressiveness as they get more and more say over the collective decision. They start to vote less extreme and more towards their actual optimum value. Now, perhaps this is surprising. This was certainly surprising to us that the followers could ever get complete control of the collective decision. If you remember, democracy just made follower votes equal the same as leader votes, not above. So how did followers ever possibly get complete control? The trick is that this kind of a plot, with a follower control phase, actually needs to have the condition that the proportion of leaders, epsilon, is less than V tilde F. So that's the cost-benefit ratio for the followers. I'm not going to go through this derivation. I hope I've provided the tools that if you're interested enough, you could go through this for yourself. But this is interesting, right? The only way to get a follower control phase is under the condition that the proportion of leaders is lower than the cost benefit ratio for the followers. This begs the question, what could we have a condition under which there isn't even a compromise phase or a follower control phase? So perhaps the plot looks more like this, where P remains on VL over CL over the course of the whole plot, and PL increases but never actually reaches 1. Turns out this is also possible when epsilon is greater than V tilde L. So if the proportion of leaders is high, or even if the V tilde L, the cost benefit ratio for leaders, is really low, we can get a condition under which the leaders control over the whole spectrum of democracy score, even right up till democracy equals 1. The reason the cost benefit ratios are so important to determining what can even possibly evolve is because of what is called a loudest voice prevails, what is colloquially known as a loudest voice prevails dynamic. Basically, as your most extreme strategy gets further and further from your optimal strategy, so to use the example with low V tilde L, V tilde L is low, the leaders have a lot of room to move into, and V tilde F down here is even lower, the followers don't have a lot of space to move into, then we can see the leaders controlling the collective decision. And likewise, if both the leaders and the followers have their cost benefit ratios at high levels, the follower control becomes more easy to obtain for lower levels of democracy. So there we have it. I'm going to wrap it up now. As much as I'd love to talk to you about democratic war, which is another possible outcome from our model, I think I'll leave it there. So what do we have? We have support for when you increase democracy, populations become less aggressive. Support for Kant's democratic peace idea. Or maybe we should have called it evolution of democratic peace as long as epsilon is less than V tilde F. That's a debate maybe we could have. Thank you for joining me, and provide any feedback. This is my first video of this sort, so if you want more derivations, less derivations, more context, just let me know, and keep in touch. Thanks a lot.